Rioso, and welcome back to the Welsh History Podcast, Freeform Edition. And let's talk a little bit, I think, this week about travel. I've been experiencing some fun with it in the last few days, and I kind of wanted to just bring up my experiences in a way, talk about comparisons between Europe and North America, and how things have changed over the years. And I kind of wanted to do this in such a way so that make it understandable to everybody, so that it makes sense and kind of come across not as a complaint, but more an observational sort of thing. And I realize not all of these are going to be the same. Not all of these are going to be equal. And so I want to be as fair as I can be. I want to talk a little bit about public transport and why I think there are so many differences between various places and kind of my opinion on some of them and the good and the bad. So let's start off from the beginning. So recently I was away. It is the end of summer 2025. Of course, the relative end of summer, as it's just about the beginning of, well, as this episode goes out, it is the 1st of September. And so this is when schools restart. This is when everything kind of kicks back up as it does normally for most people after a bit of a break, unless you're in specific situations. That's kind of what everybody experiences, at least in the Northern Hemisphere. Southern Hemisphere might have completely different methods, so I will not be covering those. So with all that in mind, we took a break, spent a week traveling. If you follow my personal Instagram, you probably were overloaded with what we were doing as we tooled around in Toronto, Ontario, and saw some of the usual touristy things and went and did a bunch of tourist related things. Met up with Rob, one of the listeners who is probably one of my longtime listeners now. And that was really, really fun. It was great to kind of meet up in person. And I really enjoyed the time that we spent just chatting. So for me, that was a great experience. And that part of the trip, for all the good and bad, I think that was one of the major good parts of the trip. The only real bad part, downside, is just airplane travel and how it works and kind of the way it works. I mean, we spent a little bit extra kind of get slightly better economy seats just out of a curiosity to see what it was like if you spent like a little bit extra just to see if you got a little bit more. Well, in this case, we got more. We actually got carry-on and checked luggage, which was nice. But it was more to see kind of how the other half lives a little bit. But it wasn't fancy. It was just, free food and slightly wider seat areas that you're sitting in. So that was nice. But I wouldn't say that the experience was all that wonderful. And it reminded me a little bit of probably the first time. Yeah, it was the first time I ever went to Wales, or to Britain in this case, in general. The flight was on Air Transat, which is, for those of you in Britain, similar to Thomas Cook. And it was rudimentary, would be, I think, being polite to it. It was very iffy. My screen was broken in an era before everybody had laptops, and definitely in an era before iPads. There was nothing to do with a broken screen. You just basically sat there and twiddled your thumbs. And I stared at my neighbor's screen because they actually had the map up and things like that. But I remember that trip really well because of how it kind of worked and how that it was obviously a bank of 3 seats, sitting there with people who I didn't know and just kind of traveling about. That experience was all right. And this was my first real trip, so to that distance. And it was a very different experience. And I've talked about it in the past, so I'm not going to go into detail about the travel and all the cultural differences and blah 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 because we've discussed that. But I think for me it was a reintroduction. Now I've flown in planes before this, and I had some experience. It wasn't like it was the first time, but it had been a while since I had, so about 9, 8 years at that point. So it was a reintroduction. This is before plane travel became what it is now. Post 9/11 and the changes in rules across most Western countries on plane travel, on security, on baggage, as the airlines themselves start to, if I'm to be polite, nickel and dime you to death. They take their pences with their pounds. It's just one of those things where you just find yourself spending more and more money just to fly in an airplane, pick a seat, to have luggage at all. It's all just here's another pound here, another dollar there, and you're going and going and going. And it's really annoying. So this is why we bought the tickets we bought this time. But I wouldn't say they're a massive improvement. They were a slight improvement over what we'd had previously. We did make the mistake of sitting on the front row the first way out. I changed that seating very quickly when I realized that actually it was worse seating sitting there than it would have been sitting a row back, just simply because the way the plane was set, there was no folding tray in front of you. It came up from the side and then kind of came out like an old school desk or a university desk kind of idea, and they were very narrow. And when you don't, fit a certain dimension, it kind of puts you in a box, literally. And so that was part of it. The other part that was nice was having the leg room and all that kind of stuff. But you take these things hoping to make the best of it, especially when you're on a plane flight that's hours long and not like a few minutes long. Like I've been on planes, really tiny planes, flying from one city to another where they were just just above a prop plane, although I've been in some of those too, and those have been delightful sometimes. And the experience was cramped and all of that, but they weren't too bad. You weren't on it very long, and you're only in 2 row seating usually, maybe 1 row seating sometimes, which is nice in its own way. But even with 2 rows, it's not that bad. I mean, you're sitting there with one other person beside you. It's not a big deal. And this particular plane flight, it was both double row seating. So you didn't have a third person in the middle who largely ends up being somebody you don't know. And so that's kind of a nice experience in that fact, I guess. If you're traveling with just one other person, it's a nice way to sit together and not have to kind of be awkward around someone else who you might not know. And for us, it was good. A lot of, reasonable. But the reality of it is that's not really what makes plane flights terrible. Thankfully, they had Wi-Fi on board. It was free, which was nice. That in and of itself was a great boon because it meant I wasn't stuck trying to watch whatever I had stored on the iPad. They didn't have any screens at all, so you never really knew where you were, which was kind of a bummer. I like that aspect of plane flying, of having an idea of, oh, we're traveling here, we're traveling there. So not having that was kind of and it'd been a long time since I've been on a plane, which didn't, so I was very confused by that. Then, but as I said, one of the biggest problems I find is that getting to the airport, getting parked if you have a vehicle, getting yourself into the airplane area, then going through the security and all of that over the years has gotten more and more complex, more and more difficult, and more awkward. And again, going back to the fact that there was reasons for this, I understand that, but you have to also understand that it makes life very difficult. It is very hard to sort of put up with to an extent because you just feel like you're so careful about anything you say or do when you're going through security. If you mishear somebody when they're explaining, well, you got to take this out or that out if you have it in your bag, and you don't really hear what they say. Next thing you know, you got to go back, you got to do it all again, but now you got to pull the thing. And, it's so much more than it ever used to be. And again, I am not complaining. This is observational. So I don't think let's put it this way. I'm not going to disagree that there's a necessity for most of it, but I would argue that there are some parts of it that I think have become very over the top, is how I would use that. And I think people are starting to realize that some of it's kind of pointless. It doesn't do very much. And they're starting to kind of come back from the extremes that they've been on lately. And by lately, I mean the last 15 years. So hopefully things will moderate. The other weird experience I have. So to understand this, and again, everybody has different experiences. Everybody lives in a different spot. So your experience is different than mine. So clarification. I didn't have my passport for this trip. We were only flying in Canada. So the only thing I needed was my driver's license. That's my government photo ID. It's the only one I have. So no problem. Get on board, blah, blah, blah. Not a problem. Fly, blah. Tried to rent a vehicle, and all of a sudden in this new province, which is still in Canada, by the way, they have completely different regulations. And oh, by the way, you have to have 2 government picture IDs. I'm like, I have 2, but one of them is not here. But I wasn't planning on bringing my passport. And it's like, why do you have this weird rule? And we just weren't allowed to rent a vehicle, which was very strange. Now, what that did do, though, is we rode trains and subways and buses, which was great for the most part. This bus that we rode on was pretty ragged and bumpy, but it wasn't bad. The trains were great. Subway was amazing. We went in the daytime, so we didn't like go party or anything. In fact, my wife is not a partier, so that was never going to happen anyway. And staying out late was just not something that would ever happen. So it was more about doing things before it got too late in the day, and then getting back to the hotel while it was still, evening but not night. And so we kind of did that. We went to various things, saw various things, did a whole bunch of stuff, and typical touristy things. But riding the buses and riding the trains, it's been a while since I've been on public transport for a lot of time. I will say that. What I did notice is that proper trains were way more convenient, way more direct, and way better. Subway was good. It was just very crowded and very hot because it was hot there. And much like, so if you've ever been in Subway, I don't know what it's like in like New York or places like that. But my experience comes from London and Toronto and Washington, D.C. And in all 3 of those places, man alive, the underground can be great until there's a million people on it at the same time. And then all of a sudden it's really hot. London was especially bad for that. Like it could be November and it still was baking down in that area. But when I was there in the summer in 2011, it was awful. And I remember that pretty clearly. And the weather wasn't even that bad. It was just so many people, bad air movement. And it was just a case of there wasn't really good air conditioning and airflow down in subway systems or the tube. And so you would go to a station and it would just be boiling. Thankfully, when you got on the train, it would be different. But in the actual station, it was hot. And that was kind of the way it was in Toronto during rush hour. It wasn't so much when it wasn't rush hour, but in rush hour, yeah, there was a lot of people and it was flowing and it was busy. And that's probably London as well. It's the same sort of thing. Toronto's a smaller city than London in population, but, similar enough environment. That was one thing that my wife, who's from a very small town, still, I think, struggles with to an extent, the urban environment, because going around there, it was like trying to keep up with where you were and where you're at. I remember notoriously, we were in the tube in London one time trying to get back to Paddington Station. If you know where that is, it's kind of the main station to head to the western half of southern England and Wales. And so we were trying to head home. And I don't remember which one of us. I think it was me. No, I think it was her. One of us got on the train first and the other just could not get on. It was impossible. It was so packed. And it was her, because I remember shouting at her and just saying, go to the next, I'll meet you at Paddington. And so she gets on, they squish on as best they can, and off she goes. And I don't even think we had the kids with us at the time. They were at home. And so yeah, she was off and running, and then I made the next train. But that's the chances you take in rush hour in London. And yeah, so it was pretty hairy, and we got to Paddington, and it was all fine, but it was a little crazy for a bit. And thankfully, it was not that bad. It was busy. It wasn't oppressively busy, although we didn't take the subway train. So I think we only stood once on the train that we were taking between the airport and the downtown, because the airport has its own dedicated train express. And so you could take that, and it only stopped like 4 times before it got to the airport, which is the way end of downtown, or way end of town of the city, in another city. Exactly. But yeah, anyway, sorry, it's a little bit of a travel log. I didn't mean it to be that. But so you had these different methods, and the convenience was very obvious, right? Driving in a major city can be absolutely terrible. My experience with it is not great, because most of the driving I've done over the years has been in smaller cities. And when I say smaller, I guess I'm saying smaller than like 2 million, because I live in a place which is over 1 million. So I can't say I live in a small city, but I have driven a lot in smaller cities. I've driven in a couple of big ones. Well, 3 big ones, I guess: Calgary, Edmonton, and Vancouver. And Vancouver was the easiest of the 3, which is funny because I know a lot of people from Vancouver would argue that's very much not the case. But I find generally the drivers are a little better. Driving around is a little better. I've never driven in England or Wales. I just never got a chance to do it. Didn't have a car. In fact, the reason why this didn't happen is because I got to Bristol. I was there maybe 3 or 4 months, I think. Well, not 4 months, 2 or 3 months, I would say, at that point. And I went into a pub to get some food, put my wallet down like a dum dum, walked away from the table, and of course the wallet was gone. And with it went my Alberta driving license. So you can't exactly replace that when you're in Britain, and you can't get a new license without retaking a test in Britain, which in the end I had to do when we came back to Canada. I had to retake the test, which really sucked, and I don't recommend. So for me, that was kind of a bummer. That will be something I will be looking to not do again, and have avoided that situation happening. And because of it, yeah, a bunch of stuff got stolen. I don't, none of it was money. That's the only good side of it. But yeah, lost a lot of other things, which was disappointing. But what do you do? And found out that some ID, even when you replace it, it's basically the same number, so you don't get away from that number. So if somebody decided to use it for nefarious purposes, oh well. But yeah, that was kind of how that worked. But so my experience in Britain is pretty much on public transport. I used to take the bus to work every day. We took the train when we were going somewhere else. I've taken the tube when I lived in London briefly for about a month. And obviously when we went to London, took the tube. So I've got decent experience on all of those things. And what I can say is this, and it may, to be fair, this is before the London Olympics, and I know they were making changes. So keep that in mind. When I talk about the tube and the London transport system, they probably are different. Specifically, what I mean by that is that the biggest thing I noticed with trains, it was very hard to find elevators. You could only really find stairs or escalators. I'm sure there are elevators on it. I'm sure now it's a lot clearer. I didn't really notice them when I was trying to move around with luggage, which was a real pain, especially when it was just stairs. That sucked. But I think one of the things that they had to do for the Olympics was change that. So I'm sure it's changed, but that was my experience. Thankfully, I didn't have to do that a lot in London. In fact, I think I only ever did it once in London properly, where I had to move stuff that I had gotten off an airplane with and had to maneuver around the city. Largely, we ended up in Gatwick, which you could avoid the city as you were going to your destination. But, because you could ride in the trains and just avoid it altogether. Trains in Britain, let me be clear, very, very convenient, very easy, fairly straightforward, although one could argue in Wales it's not straightforward, but in In other parts of England, especially, it's relatively easy to get where you want to go. You're not really limited. Even in Wales, you're not limited. What limits you is the fact that you can't go north and south through the middle or west of the country. You can only do it on the extremities, basically in England, which is one of the things that I think a lot of Welsh government officials are quite peeved about, and rightfully so. But yeah, in fact, if you look at train lines into Wales, they basically look like a reverse E, because the edge is basically the border with England. And then there's a column that goes out to the north, column that goes out to the central, and column that goes out to the west. And there's nothing in the middle, and there's nothing on the other side. And you have this fantastic coastline that you can't see from a train because they don't travel that way anymore. So that in of itself is amazing and quite annoying. And the fact that you can't just go from Cardiff to, say, Carnarvon in a reasonable amount of time. You have to go out and around, which takes so much longer, is such an inconvenience. Now, the other thing I'm going to mention, I'm sure most British people will be very familiar with, the expense of it all. It is ridiculous how much it costs to travel between towns and cities in a system where you have trains traveling everywhere. And you're encouraging, in a way, for people to take public transport because you've done things to make that a much simpler and easier method. But then the prices are extremely high. Like, to go from somewhere to London is always the most expensive way to go. If you are looking at some place outside of a local system, so in other words, where there's a local train that just goes between the major city and the surrounding areas, it's going to cost you a lot of money to travel that. And especially if you're coming from another country, it's even going to be worse because the exchange rate with pounds being what it is, that'll make that price jump even higher. And so that's something to keep in mind. And yet, it's lovely to travel by train. Train is amazing. It's so nice. The seating is better. It's not airplane seating. It's not bus seating. It's a lot nicer generally. I don't know if they've got Wi-Fi now generally on the trains. I couldn't speak to that. If they did, that would be another advantage to them. I just don't remember hearing. I know there was discussions. I don't know if it ever happened. And I don't know if it's just first class, because all of those conditions could apply from who knows what, right? Of course, you have access to your phone, and your phone has 5G. You're kind of okay. But something as a thought process, right? So as you're traveling by train and you go between cities, like I said, the convenience is nice. The fact that these trains are generally nicer trains, they're not covered in spray paint. They're not slightly well used, shall we say. They feel a lot better to travel in, at least in my experience. And if you can get a table, it's even better. And so for me, that's kind of where, if I have the money to do it, that's my preference. Travel by train. Such a nice experience, and you don't have to worry about trying to drive in a different environment with different rules and different signage. You can do it. So that's one of the reasons why we went that route. That's why we kind of stuck with that route. The last 2 times I've been there, I've never owned a vehicle. That may change in the coming year. But for me, that's kind of where I've always been, because that's, it wasn't such a difficult thing to do. So it wasn't so bad. However, it is pretty expensive, and it's not like it's something you can do all the time. Unless you get like one of those rail passes that can, if you're a tourist, that's great. If you're local, that might not be so ideal. And so it can be good in that respect. Buses are buses. They don't change no matter where you are. They're all kind of the same. And generally it can be kind of hit and miss about how good they are, how good the driver is, how good the experience is, how good the other passengers are. I've been on a bus in Cardiff where everybody was coming home from the pub and were singing along to something. Don't even remember what now. And they had a sing song from the minute they got in the bus till the end of me leaving the bus. So it was unbelievably fun to watch, although I wasn't participating. And yet it was crazy. For me, that's like so unusual coming from Canada where nobody says a word, where if somebody turns on a radio, people are upset. So that was a bit different situation and environment. A lot of the people knew each other, so that helps, of course. And then, but largely buses are buses are buses. And the only difference is that in Britain, they have double-decker buses. And when I was there last, the one thing I noticed is that's where people went to smoke because they could hide up there and the bus driver wouldn't know, I would say in quotes, because I'm pretty sure the bus driver did know because you could smell the smoke. But that was kind of where that would happen quite frequently. But kids like to go up there too, and they would sit at the front. Like my kids love to sit at the front of a double-decker bus because you were right up against the glass. So you could stare like as if you're the driver, from a high height and see all sorts of things. But problem with those double-decker buses is they're a lot bigger than other buses, and that led to interesting situations where we got stuck. As you would get into one of these lovely residential neighborhoods where everybody's parked on both sides and the road's barely wide enough for one person, and some idiot's parked on the street a little awkwardly, so now this big old bus can't get through. And in one instance, I remember my bus driver getting out and knocking all the doors, trying to get someone to come out to deal with the car that was in the way, which I'm sure they must have because we made it to work eventually. But for me, that was kind of an experience with buses. Buses to me are the worst of all of them. The reason being is that they're slow, they go all over the place, they stop all over the place, they're not always the best kept up, they can smell like all sorts of fun things, and they go through interesting neighborhoods, which can be good and bad. I will say the times when I had people speak up and talk to me usually was on a bus compared to, say, a train. Specifically, people would in Wales, rather than here, would hear my accent and suddenly, oh, what are you doing here? And the conversation would then continue. But that was what was unique about a bus, because the bus took a lot longer to get somewhere. So people were more interested because they had a half an hour to sit on a bus. And I remember we used to go and travel on a Sunday, and it literally took 3 hours to get from one side of the city to the other because we had to get off in the middle of downtown and wait for the next bus, which was about 20 to 30 minutes after the last bus to go the rest of the way. And boy, was it ever a long trip, 6-hour round trip combined with 3 hours at the thing you're going to every Sunday for pretty much 3 years was a lot. Not gonna lie, it was a lot. And I didn't love it. So that's kind of my experience with that. And buses in North America are just not ideal a lot of times too, for similar reasons. Specifically the time it takes to get anywhere. I think that's the biggest problem. And typically if you're traveling for work and you're in rush hour, the buses get absolutely packed. And if you're not in a seat, you're just rocking back and forth. And if you've ridden a bus, you know all this. So this is nothing new to you. But if you're driving, that's why a lot of people don't want to take a bus. And for me, that was the thing with it, is that it was something I did living here, simply because living here, you wanted to have certain areas of town you just don't want to you don't want to drive to. And that's kind of the way it is in a lot of cities, really. And so I would take a bus because it would be quicker, quite honestly. So I got a lot of experience with riding the buses, and buses in winter in Edmonton are fun. And take even longer when you're in the middle of snow and sleet and hail and all sorts of fun winter weather. So for me, that's one thing I consider about buses. It's one of the reasons why I look at a bus and don't particularly hold it in high regard versus, say, a train. And the subway system for me was great because it's the opposite of a bus. Yes, it's packed. Yes, it's a lot of people. Yes, it can be problematic at times. It's much more convenient because it's quicker. You know where the route goes. Typically, it's not dipsy-doodling like a bus to go to various other places to catch all these other people. You know that the route's going to be relatively straight. and you're going from one point A to point B in a relatively quick amount of time. And there's just something fun about them for me anyway. So I like riding on these kind of trains and having that experience. So it's enjoyable in its own weird little way. The However, they have their drawbacks. Again, crowded, blah blah. And they can be problematic in their own direction in that regard. But I have fond memories of it because I drove or traveled a lot in subways when I lived in Toronto years and years ago. For work, that was my only way of getting to it, typically, and it was a lot of fun. Trams are kind of similar. They are also kind of interesting. So that brings us to the automobile and the problems and benefits of it. Obviously, faster, you have control, but in that situation, you're dealing with other drivers and their habits and their tendencies and their problematic day. You might, not necessarily be having a great driving day yourself. And all of a sudden you're in accidents or there's problems or the car can be problematic. You're spending money on the car, the money on the insurance. You're an adult. This is not new. I would argue that the reason why I drive my car in Edmonton is convenience for one, but also the fact that it's not significantly cheap enough to take a public transport. That's the biggest thing I find. Public transport should really be cheaper by a significant margin to automobile usage to make them, to basically force people to use them. My little soapbox, I know. So anyway, there's been a bit of a rant about this, and I didn't mean to go off on a rant. I was more just discussing positives and negatives, and especially because I had a lot of experience with it the last couple of weeks, and it reminded me of kind of the good and the bad. There's a reason why in air travel, if I was taking a trip, which was a 2 to 3 hour drive, I would drive over taking a plane, because even though the plane was about a 50-minute plane ride, the hour you had to spend at the airport one way combined with the hour you had to spend at the airport the other way didn't make it worthwhile. Going through all that harassment, you couldn't take what you wanted. You're restricted in how you dress and what you have on you. And if you're in a vehicle, you can load it with whatever you want. You can take whatever you want. It's kind of the downfall, I think, of the new system of air travel. And I get it. I get that airlines are trying to make things cheaper. I get that they're trying to make it easier on themselves. But I do think it's problematic. I think it's creating a system wherein it's more about how many sardines we can shove into this can and how much money we can make off of them. And when you look, especially in North America, at the cost of air travel, especially in Canada, oh my goodness, the biggest thing that hits out at me isn't the cost of the actual trip. It's the cost of all of the insurance and tax that all these airlines have to pay to go into a specific airport, which just hikes the charge dramatically. And it's unbelievable. Like, it's funny to me that our government's obsessed with all these things about air travel, and being responsible and responsive by the airlines. But where is the accountability to the airports and how much they're charging and how much add-ons they're adding and how much more expensive they're making everything every single year in an environment where it is very expensive? And all of these things being what they are, I still find it a fun way to travel. It's still a great way to get around, and I enjoy aspects of it a lot. I don't enjoy the security aspects. I don't think anyone does. Not always a massive fan of the ticketing things. I find it ridiculous that having gone through security, you still have to take a hat off when you're showing people your ID. It's like, what? If I'm showing you ID that goes with the name, that has a picture that's basically my face with a non-hat on, I think you can tell that it's me. I don't know. Anyway, that was a funny little. You got to take this off if you want to be. But that's kind of where we're at right now. So it is what it is. Got to deal with it. Not much we can do about it at the minute. But one of those things I find weird with airports right now, and having become a more seasoned air traveler over the years, I definitely have grown in my opinions on some of the aspects that are meant to keep us safe, in quotes, and how effective they are and how good they are. And I think that's something as the years go on, I still sit there and roll my eyes at. Not in an old man shouts at cloud way, just as, I remember how this used to be. And sometimes the old way wasn't better, but this way isn't best. So that's something to keep in mind. With all that, thank you everyone for listening. Next week, we'll be back with a regular episode. We will then have our first Roman Britain episode proper. So I hope you'll stick around for both of those. And if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, or just chat, you can always reach me at the Welsh History Podcast at gmail.com and reach out to me on social media, usually at Welsh History Pod, unless we're talking Facebook, where it's facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. As well, if you would like to, you can help me out through the Patreon at patreon.com/Welsh History. Thank you, everyone. Take care. Have a wonderful week. We'll see you later. Bye-bye. Welsh History Podcast is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information on them, you can do so at evergreenpodcasts.com. Thanks for listening.